All right, everybody, welcome to Satsang. Today is the 5th of November, which is pretty exciting. Yesterday in the United States was Election Day, which is, I think, to quote Shakespeare, sound and fury signifying nothing. So we had that day yesterday, and it was really a lot of fun. And actually, I guess it was 2 days ago. It's a funny election this year because the election was held on a day, but it feels like it's still going on because it wasn't a day full. It's evidently going to be a month full. So anyway, so who knows which day it was, but it was recently. I can guarantee it was recently. So, and we're going to actually talk about that a little bit because that's a lot of. I find that if you want to play with stories, one of the places that stories are the most absolutely crystallized and identified with is in politics. And so I listen to a lot of people talk about, doing spiritual work and they don't go near politics. And I always think to myself, well, wow, that's actually where one of the best places to go to, because that's really where everything's solidly planted. So anyway, um, I I was thinking today just to kind of start with I usually do the basics, and there's a whole different way to do the basics. You can do them. Sometimes I use a spiritual journey, but this time I thought I'd use the Nisargadatta approach. And when Nisargadatta was asked the question, what are the basics? He would lay out four different things, and here's kind of how he would go after it. He'd say, hey, you know what? Think about how you came to be. He said, first of all, he said, there was the sperm of your father and the egg of your mother, and it was cultivated in your mother's womb, and a body and a form were born. And he said, somewhere about the age of 2 years old, you were told, hey, guess what? You're an individual, and here's your name and here's your form. And so that became your onboarding of who you thought you were. Now that's a really critical place, because I want you to, isn't that funny? Like the very first thing that happens, which is you taking on this idea or being taught this idea that what you are is this body, and that this body has a name, and that's who you are. The reason it's so critically important is that every single thing that we learn from that point on, in all of the books and everything that's done, revolves around that one little piece of whatever. Um, every story that's told, read a novel, guess what? There are forms with names running around doing things, and that's how a novel happens. Read history, guess what? There are forms running around with names, and they're doing things. That's called history. You want to know about just about anything, and there are forms with names running around doing things, except for maybe geography. And in a way, you could probably even say that a sedimentary layer is different from which one of the others. There's three of them. But anyway, I don't know. Maybe those are forms of names running around doing things. But nonetheless, that's how stories end up, is by accepting that. And so at some point in time, you realize that you are, and you feel your own quote unquote presence, and that presence is consciousness. Now, when we talk about that, consciousness is the principle of movement and activity, and it has a tangible sense and a tangible feel. So that's the first thing that happens. Now, do you remember being consulted about whether you were going to be born? Do you think your mom and dad planned it? Did think about all of that stuff. So clearly something happens where there's a drop in, right? And the drop in is, this is what you are. But what you really are, if you think about it for a moment, who am I, is the actual energy, or the awareness that then created itself into consciousness. That's who you really are. So you always were, you always will be, always have been. There's a perfect eternalness to who it is that you are. So what gets dropped in on top of that is this phenomenal piece. Now, a lot of times in spirituality, we use the term phenomenal and noumenal. Those are philosophic terms, and why we use them, I have no idea, but we do. So I might as well cave in and use them as well. But all phenomenal means is that it appears in consciousness. Consciousness is a perceiving activity. It's the principle of movement and action in a perceptive bubble. That's what it is. That's all consciousness really is in its complete form, and it has tangibility. So that tangibility, there's volume, right? In other words, this body mind has volume. So within this bubble of perception, things have tangibility. So what happens is the drop-in that says, I am Alan, you are James, you are Donovan, you are Justine, that piece gets handed to you somewhere in the process. And that is what we call phenomenon. That's phenomenal living in the physical world of perception. But actually what's going on and what you always were was the noumenon, which is the eternal principle, which is can't be perceived, can't be felt, can't be cognized. It simply is what you always were. And in fact, before consciousness arose out of that awareness, you couldn't even say that there was anything to be aware of. So when somebody says that awareness is, perfect awareness is unaware of itself, it's because there are no things in that. There's just awareness. That's all there is. So that's the basics. So that's how you start. You're a drop-in, right? Then the second principle that Nisargadatta would talk about, he'd say, and then the thing that happens is that there's this thing called Maya. And Maya is the belief system that you are an autonomous individual and that you are making all of your decisions. So that's part of it. And then the other part of Maya is that you are separate from all that is. There's you and there's the world out there. So those are the components of Maya. And so those get repeated over and over and over to you as you go along. And Maya ends up being the principle that creates what we call phenomenal living. And then we place that in a story in our head, this phenomenal living, and then we conflate. And conflate's a word that says we jam it together. There's your definition for conflate. And what all that happens is pretty soon the story and the phenomenal living go together. So if you tell a story, you actually think you're doing some phenomenal living. And in a way you are, your mind is operating, but all that is the theme music to the phenomenon, right? So your mind produces theme music called a story. And then that story does that. So that's how that ends up happening. So that's the second piece, Maya. So the first piece is you're eternal. You are an absolute eternal piece. What arises out of that eternalness, if you will, pure awareness, is consciousness and phenomenon stuff. You do a drop in on the stuff and start to believe that you're the drop in, that you aren't the stuff from which it arose and which you've always been. So all there is a misidentification, right? Now that misidentification creates, in essence, a split mind. What do I mean by that? Well, think of it for a minute. If you didn't believe that you were something separate, you would just simply be seeing the entire world from consciousness or from awareness itself. There would be no thing called you in there that was doing perceiving. But because we believe that we are the individual or the thing that we've said we were, the drop-in, as I called it, then the drop-in basically has its perceptive mind, which then covers the mind of awareness. But there's two things going on in there. And all we've done is by misidentifying is covered the awareness, the perceiving from awareness itself. So that's the second thing to remember is Maya. And then the third thing to remember is that there's a thing called time and space. So could you perceive yourself as there wasn't time and there wasn't space into which was extruded or protruded this phenomenon, which has tangibility. So you have to have duration and you have to have space to hold the volume. So I can take Dan's body. If I don't have any space, I can't perceive Dan's body. If I don't have any duration, I can't perceive Dan's body. So time and space, duration and space are a creation of consciousness. The principle of activity creates the container that time and space happen within. And then the misidentification of who you are, that body that you think you are, begins to walk around believing it's the story that's living inside of that time and that space. But what happens when time and space simply collapses and isn't any longer? Then all you are is pure awareness itself, right? So that's the third principle, recognizing that time and space comes along with this Maya thing, because Maya can't do its dance and your misidentified self can't do its dance on the floor without time and space. So 1, 2, 3. And then the fourth principle is, wouldn't it seem to you that you could go back to what you were before you were told that you were a form and a body and a name, and bought into that belief? And can you see that if you could stand there, that all of those misidentifications would no longer be there, and the perceiving would be from awareness itself? And when that happens, we call that coming home, awakening, enlightenment, whatever you want to call it, right? So when you hear me talk about that the spiritual journey is a retracing, you can see what I've done. I went, here's what happens. One, right? We have the body that shows up, which is just a piece of something in the phenomenal world. We decide it actually is something, and we decide intellectually it's a story, and we put the theme music of us with it, and we have a name, and we are in essence assuming that that's what we are. So that's number one. Number two, we have Maya, which pretends that the stuff that we're seeing is what's actually there, and not the stuff, the eternalness that we are that lives underneath it. And number three, we need time and space. And the fourth way that Nisargadatta talks about it, he says, well, wait a minute, wouldn't it make sense that you could go back to before those three things happened? A return to home, a return to what you are, an awakening. And that's the way that Nisargadatta would say these are the basics. There was a fellow that showed up in his satsang, and he only had 3 days, and he came morning and night. And he said, hey, I only have 3 days. I'm coming morning and night. I've heard so much in these days. I can't hold it all. Can you just give me the basics? Because when I leave, I need to know, what do I want to concentrate on? So those are the basics as Nisargadatta gave him. It was like, here's the, I forget the name of, we used to have cliff notes, but here are the cliff notes to spirituality. Remember these 4 things. See you later. Have fun. So that's how that piece happens. So it was really interesting that one of the questions, and James, I'm going to go back to a question you asked me long ago before I tackle the 2 that you've given me. But James long ago said, can you speak to us about some techniques to maintain a conscious perspective as we toggle back and forth from mind to story and vice versa? And I just wanted him to say, if you can see that what Nisargadatta did was he sent this man off, and he said, if you know who you are, then there's not a technique, but it's just a remembering of who you are that becomes the only thing that you need to do. If you keep going back to the who am I, what am I am the awareness before all of this arose, that's a way to deal with the toggling that you speak of, because it's just that simple one-step remembering. So the Nisargadatta is a 1, 2, 3 reverse. It's almost like a dance, right? 1, 2, 3, back to the beginning, back to before number 1, so you could see what was actually happening. That's the spiritual journey, as Nisargadatta has it, and that's the only thing that you need to remember. He talked about when he found his guru, all he did was locate himself in the I am. His guru says, just go be in the I am, because the I am is the sense of presence that lives in consciousness. and underneath that lives pure awareness. So the idea is, if you just simply sit in the I am, if you're always in presence, that eventually that collapses underneath and one will move into the pure awareness itself. So there's kind of your philosophical piece that I was talking about. Now, when we talk about the election in a minute, I'm going to go back to the Maya piece. So remember Maya, because it's just magnetic and gluey, and it grabs onto you, and it's the part that keeps you fooled and misidentified. So we're going to go back and talk about that in a minute. But I'm going to answer James's question first, and then we're going to have some election talk. Dan, you're a little late. I began by talking about how the election, because it's where, for some reason, certainly in the United States, we're so identified with the election that it's really a great place to go. If you really want to see where you're hooked, go take a peek at the election, because baby, if you're not hooked anywhere else, you may still be hooked there. So it's a fun place. It's a fun place to kind of play. So James said, if the moment is living us, how do we recognize it? So remember, I talked about the split mind, right? When you're actually before the split mind, when Nisargadatta says, go back to pure awareness, wouldn't it make sense to you that you could, from pure awareness, see the entirety of what has arisen without assuming that you're an ego? Because you haven't made that step yet. And he calls that apperception. And what that means is that you're not perceiving from James, you're perceiving from pure awareness, right? That's that we call apperception. So if the moment is living us and it's recognized, it's from that place. Because you remember, I talked about how we assume that we're here, right? One of the assumptions that we make is, who are we? I'm me, and everything else is out there, right? So there's two components to the me and this world I live in. We automatically are taught to make that. But the reality is, there's no such thing, right? There's simply the arising of all of it, right? The me and the stuff out there is one single thing. We're taught to separate ourselves from it, but it's just one thing. So the apperception is going to see all of that at once, right? And when the seeing is from all of that at once, you can't miss the fact that you're being lived into the moment, because it all arises at the same time in one thing. That perception gives you the sense that you're being lived into the moment. How else could it be, right? In other words, if everything plus me arises as a single movement, then there's no me looking and going, oh, there I am within that stuff that I've also called the outside or the world, and it's me dancing in the world as though those two things are separate. So it's really important to see that those two things aren't separate, even though we have a story that tells us that it is. So that's how that recognition happens, right? When we take, now here's the next piece, because this is such a great second question. It's such a beautiful second question, right? When we take action, must it always be spontaneous to be authentic? Well, if everything arises as one piece always, would you call that spontaneous? Right? So if you're apperceiving, then all action is spontaneous, therefore all action is authentic. The only time action is inauthentic is when the ego sits on top of the authentic happening and parrots a different story. It parrots its story, and you can feel there's like something wrong there, right? You can feel the slip and slide between the ego's story and what's happening underneath it. But if it's seen, even if the ego is speaking, but it's all seen as a one-step movement, that's as authentic as it could possibly be. It's just simply it all depends on how it's perceived. So there's the piece to your second question. So anyway, I wanted to talk just a little bit about the election, because I thought that would be like a lot of fun, because what you can do over the next weeks is really watch how people use story to try to keep themselves egoic. This is, we're in the throes of the next few weeks, and baby, this is about, like, you're going to watch people work as hard as they ever have to stay egoic. That's what's going to be happening here these next few weeks. So if you think about it for a minute, if you're simply apperceiving, if the apperception is happening and you see the movement in consciousness and it's just happening by itself, right? It would be pretty easy to see that there is absolutely nothing permanent or stable in consciousness. It is the principle of movement. The only thing permanent is pure awareness. So only when in touch, only when standing in the place of pure awareness will stability or permanent peace or all the rest of whatever be felt. That's the only place that's the only time that's the only, and when I say time, there's no time there. So remember, when you start using words like time and you put them in a place where there's no time, that really screws it up. So I want to note that, but I'll be using the words as though that were true anyway. Because when you're in time and space, you can only speak from time and space. That's one of the problems with speaking, is that it lives in time and space, and you're talking about something that's not. But nonetheless, with that inherent difficulty already dealt with, just simply recognize that when you apperceive and there's motion and happening, it's clearly seen. There's no such thing as a solid place or a place to be. But what happens with the ego is that we have an intuition that says, wait a minute, I know there's a permanent place to be. And so the ego says, good, I'm going to go find that. Right? Fool's journey can't happen. Not possible. There's no such thing permanent within the world of consciousness. It doesn't exist. But the ego is going to try to do that. How does the ego do it? Because this Maya thing is really powerful. So it runs around and it tries to find permanent things, right? Now, one of the really great ways to make your ego feel really solidly in place is to identify and judge someone else, because if you can get them in a permanent place, your ego is going to feel like it's in a solid place too, right? So here's where stories come into play. Identification is the embrace of a single story to the exclusion of all others. And in fact, if you listen to people in relationships, I always make fun of people in relationships, because you go into a restaurant and eavesdrop and 40 years in, and they're still trying to convince each other of who they are. Because if the person says something and it doesn't match to the thing doesn't match to the model that the other person thinks they are, they're going to go, no, that's not quite who I am. I'm really this. Now, we live in a world of men and women, and I've always noticed that once a woman hangs around a man for 40 years, she doesn't really seem to need any more information about who you are. She seems to have kind of figured that out. And yet, you find men, and it goes both ways. It's just, I'm a man, so of course I notice this, that a lot of men go to great extents to tell women who have been with them for long periods of time who they are. And women are really sharp about that. They kind of got this down. They notice the pattern. So it's something to think about. That's what we do. What is trying to happen then? If I can get her to accept who I am as a solid, that's what it is. As an ego, I will feel solid, right? So trying to find stability in a world of not stability. So now we go out and watch politics, right? So, oh, you're a Trump voter. Well, that must mean you're a moron and a racist, and you've never been educated and whatever. Oh, you're a Democrat, right? Well, you're a socialist and fill out the same list, right? So what is happening is that by creating sides, the ego needs to believe that those sides are somehow firmly planted somewhere. And the way that it does that is by identifying. Now we're doing it in groups. So that's pretty cool, right? 70 million people voted for Trump, and they're all, I can tell you what they are, 70 million people with 5 kind of characteristics. And that's what we're engaging in. We really are. We're really engaging in that. Oh, and there's 70 million on the other side. Guess what? Those 70 million are bop, 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 bop. And now the ego's happy, right? For a very small moment, because tomorrow is going to come some piece of news that's going to screw that all up. And the ego is going to have to re-engineer what it thinks that Democrats and Republicans are, because something showed up and it doesn't match anymore. And the ego gets thrown off in terms of feeling like it has some footing. So I know, and I know Donovan really loves this one. One of the best metaphors to think about the way that consciousness really works is to think about surfing. Surfers are these amazing people, and the one thing that they know is that there is a stability within motion. One is one with the motion itself. So when you go out and you get on a wave, the worst thing you can ever do is be so arrogant as to believe that you could control that wave, or that you in some way, shape, or form are the author of what's going to happen on that wave. Ask any surfer, they'll say, no, no, don't do that. that's not a good way to go after this one, right? So surfers learn that if they just simply are the wave itself, which means they're a body in motion, they're living on a wave in motion, and they're one with that motion, that there is a place of there's a perfect sense of movement in that place, right? That's where they are. And so life is the same way. It's an acceptance of what is. The acceptance of what is, what that does is it dissolves the need for permanence. If there's an acceptance of whatever arises in motion, what need would permanence serve when there's an acceptance of whatever the motion is? And then there's an allowance when what that allows is the movement back into pure awareness itself, right? Because you're not fighting about whether you're controlling something, whether you're doing something. The separation of the ego and everything else and its engagement with all of that keeps one from returning to pure awareness itself. You know, it's like, hey, I've got $1 million back here at the house. It's just, sorry, honey, I'm out here in the front lawn fighting over a piece of fried chicken. That's kind of what the spiritual journey ends up looking like, right? I will fight you to the death over, whether Trump's an asshole. I've got $1 million in the house. No, hold on, hon. I'm out, I got a Trump thing going here. Sorry, I'm fighting over a piece of chicken. So that's that's what the ego does, right? So you hear me use the pointer, the need to feed, right? So all the need to feed is you go out, get on social media, say anything that you think, and the first thing that's going to come back is someone disagreeing with you, and you now have been invited to a need to feed contest, because you get to try to prove that what you said to begin with is the how it is. And while the $1 million is back in the house, you're fighting over a piece of chicken, and that's the need to feed. And I swear, social media is the place that holds the need to feed better than anywhere else that I have ever seen. It's the magnetism of Maya, because it's incredibly magnetic. It draws you to it. We're so used to doing it. We go back again and again and again. So now the only reason I brought up the election, because I think it's just really, really fun, is for the price of no admission, right? You get to watch how everybody is going to organize themselves around judging the other side and others that are in the spectrum, and how they clamp down and try to really, really have, a single version of what they have to have. And my God, that has to be that way. So you get to watch that. So I'm inviting you not to play in it. I'm inviting you to watch it, because there's incredible learning that can be had. And then here's the next thing that you get to do. When you listen to Nisargadatta, remember I went through step 1, 2, 3, and 4. And what he did is he said, you're born as a form and you accept that that's what you are. Maya is this magnetic stuff that makes you really believe and identify with what you are. And it all happens in time and space. But wouldn't it be nice, don't you think, if you could go back to the very beginning, that you could see from pure awareness itself? That's what he says, right? So what he's doing is he's replacing one story with another. You see how he did that? He created the first 3 steps for a story. And then he said, wait a minute, what if we could go back and stand in the original story? We never thought of that story. But actually, if you think about it for a minute, that story works as well as the first one I told you. The ego story and the awareness story, they both really work in this thing. So why don't we play with the awareness story and see what happens? So here's what you get to do. You get to look at the other side and say to yourself, what are the stories that I could put in that place so that I could stand where they stand? What is that story that does that? And I'll tell you one of the ones I do that works for me every time. So, but that's a story you can tell yourself, right? But just the activity of replacing one story with another starts to shake the grip, that egoic Maya grip. It starts to shake it because you can't replace one story with another, right? And stay firmly entrenched with only one story, right? You can't do that. So you start to replace one story with another. That's what you do. So here's how it is. I come from a family. I was raised in California in the 60s. Probably don't have to tell you what the Allen story's political leanings are. I'm as Dan will tell you, and you all know I'm liberal, no doubt about it. The Allen story is a liberal story. Got it. The Beatles, Grateful Dead, all that stuff, Summer of Love, it's all in there. I got it all. So, but what was really handy is that the other side of my family, when I inherited it at about 4 years old, was a Southern Utah family. Stepfather worked in the uranium mine and basically went into the Navy and went to the Korean War. And that was a graduation from the uranium mine. Imagine that kind of a life, right? And then eventually got into college and got an accounting degree and, lived a really wonderful life. And so that's a lower socioeconomic or a lower middle class, if you will, or upper poor class. It lives in that world. And so when you look out at that world, it's easy to see that over the last 20 or 30 years, that folks that live in that place in our society have lost all hope. And the only hope that they have is to somehow or another blow up the system. If the system continues how it is, they are going to live in no hope forever. So their story is, let's blow the system up. Guess who they think is a really good candidate to do that? Probably don't have to tell you. Trump, perfect candidate to do that. So if you can stand in a place of hopelessness and say, my only chance at life is to blow this system up, who would I vote for? You're probably going to come to the same conclusion. And the minute that you do that, you've humanized the other side, right? Because in that hopelessness it's easy. Any human who can stand in the sense of hopelessness of another human being and look at the options that human being has is going to come to a certain conclusion. Now, do you think that all the other things that they're painted with matter compared to living in a world of hopelessness for 20 or 30 years? If you thought your kids never had a chance to go to college, if you thought, think of the things that you think out of hopelessness. That's all that occupies your entire world, right? So there's a story. Now that story I just told is my version, right? You can make up another one. There's probably 100 stories that you can make up for why it's happening over there on the other side. As you do that, you're going to find that your grasp on having to have it a certain way starts to release. It can't help itself. You can't hold all those stories at the same time and start to believe that any one of them is so compelling that it has to be the one. Because the minute you think that, you're going to come up with a better one. And you go, okay, well, put that on the side. I got a better one now. So the actual activity of changing those stories loosens your mind. It loosens your identification energy. And it's a really great practice. So as the next weeks unfold, you're going to feel it. Here's how it happens, right? You read something and it hits you right in your solar plexus. And you go, ugh, right? Okay. What has happened is that you have just glued yourself to whatever your preferred story is. It has been assaulted. Whatever you've read has assaulted your preferred story. And the minute you feel that, it is your opportunity, baby. You now get to take the story that has assaulted your preferred story and find a way to place yourself in that story in such a way that it makes sense what is happening in the story that assaulted your preferred story. It's your opportunity. You get to step into that moment. And that is a way of breaking identification. How do I stand in the other story, right? You start to do that. Now, this is a lot of fun. Maybe not everybody finds it as fun, but I giggle and laugh when I do this because I take the most absurd damn stories. I take stories that I think nobody could humanize. And you know what? Somehow or another, a story always comes and it ends up happening. It makes me laugh how idiotic it is. But the minute that it happens, the hate goes away, the upset goes away, it all goes away. Everything leaves, right? Because I am them and they are me, which is kind of how it is all along. If you're sitting down with someone who's a Trump supporter, and that Trump supporter is having a cup of coffee with you, what you're doing is having a cup of coffee. You don't even think about what kind of supporter they are. You're just having a cup of coffee. It's only when the story comes into play that you find a way to divide yourself. So what's life about? Having a cup of coffee or having a political opinion? You get to start to decide that over the next few weeks. So I got some questions here, huh? All right, that's pretty cool, huh? All right. I got Justine. She says, I've started watching both sides of the political narrative to broaden my views and get more understanding. However, instead of giving me more clarity or understanding, it has left me even more confused and quite honestly disheartened. I suppose it is the journey to see that all is illusion. Yeah, that's exactly it, right? Why are you disheartened? Think about that for a minute. You're disheartened because you believe that if you can find the fixed story, everything will be okay. So one of the passages that everyone has to make in the spiritual journey is to see the disheartening that happens and understand that's just the story that you hold that says, if I can find a place that's solid, I'll be okay. And if I can't, I have to give up my dream of finding somewhere solid. So back to my thing, there's $1 million in the house. If we can quit arguing about the piece of chicken, we can go in the house and get the $1 million, right? What your thing doesn't include, the reason you're disheartened is you don't see, or you're not letting yourself include in your story that it's okay to be confused. And the reason you are confused is there's no such thing as a story that's true. There just isn't. They're all made up. Every one of them. Every single one of them. Right? I'm walking down the street. I see a child. I give a child a hug. I'm a loving human being. I walk 20 feet more. Some guy says, you're an asshole. And I knock him down on the ground and I'm a violent felon. I went from a loving man that hugs children to a violent felon in 20 feet. Right? Which of those stories is true? You got 5 seconds. The Jeopardy music is running. Right? I'm neither. Right? I hugged a child and I knocked a guy down. But because the human mind wants to have that you're one of those two things, that conflict comes into play. So if you can hold it, there's no such thing other than the story that you create from all of what you receive in terms of mental input. The intellect creates that story. You're going to see that every time you get a different piece of input or a change in input, you got to make up a new story, right? So there's no reason to be disheartened when you know that what you are is pure awareness, right? If you can just hold that very beginning story, I am pure awareness. Everything that I see in front of me is just simply being generated for my viewing pleasure. And this idea that I would have an idea about it, there literally is no I to have an idea about it. You made that was made up. You were told that's what you were. You believed it to such a degree that I is running around in your story. doesn't truly really exist, except for that you accept it as though it exists and live as though it exists. That's what makes it real. So seeing from pure awareness eliminates that piece of fiction, right? So it is in the journey to see that it's all an illusion, but what goes with that, and you're a healer, so you know this, when you are a conduit for the healing energy, you are absolutely rooted. Next time a healing is happening and you're doing something, notice how stable it is. That's because that conduit is from pure awareness into consciousness and into healing. So you're in touch in that moment with stability. Then the mind will come in and say, oh, that stability is something that lives in the egoic world. It's not. That's not where it is. So yes, the journey is to see it's all an illusion, but it's also to see that that illusion is created for your viewing pleasure, and all you are is the awareness that watches it. So there's something else. You see, there's something else there. It's not a hopeless dive into a chasm of nothingness. Well, it kind of is, but I could explain that differently. But the idea that there isn't anything, it's hopeless. The hopelessness comes from not including in your story that what you are is pure awareness itself. You are divinity itself. You are all that is. Right. So if you add that into the story, you get to see the journey as an illusion, but within the container of you as awareness. And if it's always within that container, you know, permanent, solid awareness. That's where that one lives. All right. So here we go, from James to everyone. So how does 140 million voters come to see one narrative? Here's a really funny thing. If you go to each one of those 140 million, you're going to get 140 million stories. There really isn't one narrative. Even every liberal, when they talk to each other, they're going to have differences in how they see things, right? They're going to concentrate in this or that or one of the other things. That always is true. But when it turns around and comes to the output to make yourself feel solid, you define and identify all of the other voters as one thing. So all of a sudden you take 140 million differences and you take half of that, which is 70 million, and say that's how they are. And you take the other half and say that's how we are. And in that moment, you have solidified each side. And that's what happens in that particular instance. So what happens is that we create the one narrative to classify everybody to make ourselves feel more solid. But that's not really how it is. Go up and down the street and find 5 people who have what you consider to be fairly identical points of view, and you will find they have differences in how they see things and what they think is important. Easy to do. But then when they talk about the other side, there's only one thing. And when they talk about our side, all of a sudden those differences disappear and we're one thing. And that's what's happening there. That's what's happening in that question. Okay. So here's the thing, Donovan. Does that mean that you believe the other story or both? Right? When you start to play story for story, belief drops. It can't help itself, right? Because what you start to do is come up with stories that are easily believable, but it's not possible to believe them both or all 3 of them or all 10 of them, right? So just playing with the activity of switching stories, you're going to give up trying to believe them. You can't. Not possible. You just can't do that. And that takes care of itself. You don't even need to think about it. Just play with the stories. You'll start to laugh when that happens because you'll want to believe the next story. And then you want to believe the 3rd story, and you're going to get to about the 7th or 8th. Well, you may probably, Donovan, for you, it's going to happen at 3rd or 4th. If you're dumb like Alan, it's 7th or 8th. And finally I go, holy cow, you can't do this. There's no way I can believe in every single one of these. It's just not possible. And then you just get to play with the stories themselves. Right. And you know, when you hold both sides, I mean, that's a beautiful moment, right? The kind of the stuff goes away. And the other one is believe in a preferred story, right? So the Donovan character is a story, and in that story, you're going to find Donovan has kind of a point of view about things. But when you see Donovan from pure awareness itself, then Donovan just has a preferred story like every other story. So clearly the Alan story is a liberal. When Alan looks out at the world, he says that love and compassion and sympathy is kind of, that seems to be what the liberal point of view should be, right? What's really hilarious now, though, is I always say that Trump has really done us a great service because he ripped the cover off of who we are in some ways. He basically held a hate party. And the one thing that I didn't expect was all the liberals to show up for it, but they did. So in a way, if you're like me and you're a liberal, man, you got to look at yourself in the mirror now, because I'm looking at what the liberals are saying and going, no, that's not who we are. No. But see, that's the story. Who we are is the Allen story going, hey, there's a who we are. There isn't a who we are, right? From pure awareness, it's just a happening, and then stories get made up, they get plastered on top. It's theme music, right? And Justine says, damn it, I was going to say that you are both. And you're right. Absolutely right. And Dan, you're killing me too. So anyway, that's the other comment here. It says, Dan, you're killing me. So anyway, use what you see arise in your world as a laboratory, and start to practice these. Just start to play with them. It's like I told James, if you can see yourself as pure awareness and you're looking from that place and everything arises, you and everything else at the same time, you're going to get one kind of viewing that happens. When you start to replay story for story, that takes you back to that pure awareness place, because it releases you from the identification. That's just another technique on the way back, right? I hate to call it a technique. I guess it probably is, but it's just something you can do when you see things arise. When think about what misidentification is. In order to cure misidentification, you need to replace that with proper identification, right? In other words, the recognition that you are pure awareness, or the noumenon, and not the phenomenon. In other words, that's what you're doing. You're replacing one with the other. So the actual coming home is a replacing of one story with another story. And all I did was give you the two stories. One of them says, I'm a piece of consciousness. I was given a name. I accepted that. I'm autonomous and I make up my own story, right? And then underneath, what you really are is your pure awareness, right? That has none of those things that live in time and space, and it generates what you're seeing. So the story you see is just being generated, and that replaces the first story. And one way that can happen is by just simply replacing stories all the time. It's just a way to do that. That's all I'm talking about today is the actual flexibility in the intellect to replace those stories. And that's where I'm living right now. All right. Not bad, guys. We did good. Any other brilliant questions? That was pretty dense tonight, huh? That was fun. I had a good time with that. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'll move towards an ending here. For all of those who are not, that don't have something to read, the Nisargadatta pointers. I don't know if you're still reading that, Donovan, or not. Really a great thing to kind of play with some of what I'm talking about today. And all of the Satsangs are out. They're recorded. You can always go out on YouTube, by the way, and find Nisargadatta or Ramesh Balsekar. There's several others. If you ask me or want to know, just anything you need to know about where you may want to head, shoot me a little note. I'll tell you. I'll give you what I think is kind of next. A friend of mine, Dan, and I have a friend, and his name's Brandon, and so he's now reading a thing called The Black Swan, which is really another one of those story replacement things. The black swan is something that that Westerners didn't even know existed, and so when they saw one, they couldn't accept that it even was a thing, because there was no such thing as a black swan. So if you think about our life, 9/11 was a great example of that. No one thought that was possible, and it happened, and no one could get their arms around it. That was what we call a black swan. Black swans are really cool when you're playing in story switch, right? Because anything that's outside of what you think is possible that can happen, and it happens, or you can even create that it happens, it breaks up your grip on story. So that so anyone anyone who wants to play with stories, if you want a book or something, usually I'll know you well enough to tell you what you ought to think of. And I also want to say, I've got from Justine, good to see you guys. And you want to meet at Hill Street for a cuppa. I to this day, I want you to know I miss Hill Street. Yeah. I do. It's family. It's who we are. It's a most wonderful story ever. So thanks for that comment, Justine. All right, everybody. I love you dearly. Thanks, Donovan. Thanks, Dan. Thank you, James. Thanks, Justine. It was rocking fun. And I will see everybody in 2 weeks. We'll have another one, and we'll do it all over again. You have any questions, bring them. And Dan, I love you. Can't wait for you to come again. Bye, guys.